Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Mr. John Gunnison and myself are back at it again. As democracy appears to be teetering, we have a post-election autopsy episode to get into. So I will try and explain to you how wrong I was and why I was so wrong about many things, including Harris potentially winning, like I predicted. And also, I thought the Puerto Rican vote was going to go massively for Democrats, but neither of those things happened. And then we'll also discuss maybe where Democrats can improve on their campaigning, messaging, and how they look at the electoral map moving forward. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom because we do have midterm elections in 2 years. So now is the time to figure out what went wrong so that we can fix it and hopefully take back the House and make a dent in the Senate.
So, Justin, when we last recorded, for anyone who heard the most previous episode, we both ranted and monologued about separate topics for a period of about 20 minutes, right? So in your segment, you were talking about how Puerto Rican voters were going to move en masse towards Kamala Harris, and you were proven completely wrong about this. In mine, I was talking about how Trump had successfully sold to the American public the idea that he was a dove, that he was anti-war, and that this was all bogus. I've been proven completely correct. So you were wrong and I was right.
I do not know about. Tulsi Gabbard, John, is the perfect nominee to lead the office of the Director of National Intelligence. She is certainly going to go start wars, and she is the one that Putin and Assad are so afraid of. You're right.
Justin, I made two claims. The first was that Trump had successfully sold the idea of himself as anti-war to the public. This was vindicated by lots of exit polls and polls after the election results. And the second claim was that this was all a lie and it was bogus. And this has been validated by some of the appointments that Trump has announced, including Marco Rubio, a big fan of regime change as Secretary of State, and Pete Hegseth, an enormous fan of war crimes, as his nominee for the Department of Defense. So I feel great about everything that I said last week, and I know that that's not shared by you.
I wouldn't feel great about President Trump being in office. And
yes. So I don't feel great about what happened. I feel great about my own commentary.
I don't know if it's a time to gloat, but you go ahead and do that. So let's hit the Puerto Rican vote, the nail on the head. I do feel great about most of what I said. So most of what I said was the Harris campaign was doing an awful job at reaching out to these voters. And I cited a few things. One, a policy platform that appeals to them coming out the Sunday before the election, which is a little bit crazy to me, or 10 days before the election, rather. I think that was malpractice. Another thing is the way that she and her campaign was making outreach to these voters, bringing in AOC, who inherently turns most of these voters off. My premise of the case, though, was these voters, while being swing voters, typically tend to go Democrat 65-30, 65-35. And the comments at MSG would help at least reach that number, juice turnout, maybe make it even more. Where I was wrong, so I do think the MSG comments definitely had an impact and helped staunch the bleeding, so to speak.
I want to ask a clarifying question about a point that you just made a second ago, Justin, because I think this is actually pretty interesting. So you said that Harris made a mistake by campaigning with Ocasio-Cortez, and that she, even though she is a Puerto Rican American, very prominently so, is someone who actually repels or turns off Puerto Rican American voters. I'd love for you to elaborate on that, because I think that would be an interesting thing to hear more about.
Yeah, so I'm not saying she shouldn't never campaign with a leftist like AOC necessarily, but for these voters, she was going to events in Allentown, in Reading, Pennsylvania, in different Philadelphia, with AOC, and prominently uplifting her as a reason why these voters should vote Democrat and vote for VP Harris. The dynamic that folks maybe aren't aware of in the Harris campaign, maybe their staffers are so progressive that they just see their world in their own reality. I did say this on the last podcast, so that's why I'm somewhat confident in my take here. And we need to understand, John, for decades, Republicans have been branding Democrats as socialist. However, what you have with AOC is somebody that may not be a socialist, but certainly has espoused socialist views in the past, went down to the island of Puerto Rico, endorsed a socialist candidate for governor who also wanted independence for the island. The voters that moved mainland to Pennsylvania tend to be more socially conservative, and also because of what is going on the island of Puerto Rico, foreign malign influence from Cuba, foreign malign influence from Venezuela, a faction of their politics that is legitimately Latin American socialists that absolutely repels these folks, kind of like the Cubans in Miami are repelled from the term of socialism. The Venezuelans in Miami are repelled from the term of socialism. By cozying up with AOC, who is coded as a socialist by these voters and then endorsed a socialist candidate on their island, she, in effect, basically showed them that maybe she was socialist. And that probably helped Trump's, negative messaging seep through. And most specifically, where it makes the biggest difference for these voters is the economy. And as we saw, MSG was not the number one issue. It was economic concerns of cost of living increases for this voting bloc and a lot of voting blocs in this election. So in effect, what she was doing is she was helping to legitimize Trump's attacks on her, saying that she would be awful for the economy by palling around with AOC. And I just think that that's been a little bit overlooked, especially by mainstream media.
So it's interesting because there's really two strands here, and they're possibly compatible, but also possibly divergent explanations for why campaigning with Ocasio wouldn't be helpful. Number one is the basic thing of the limits of representation politics, which is something the Democratic Party, I think, are starting to learn after this election. Just because you have someone from a demographic group doesn't mean you're automatically going to have affinity with other people in that group. And if there are other issues, you could call them kind of secular issues that are more top of mind, something like inflation. It doesn't matter if the person telling you the wrong policy idea or the wrong talking point is from your group. It's just irrelevant. The second thing is perhaps incompatible with that, which is that there are actually issues with Ocasio as a spokesperson that are specific to her relationship with the community. And that has to do with a view on statehood and other issues on the island's politics, where she has an opinion that's not shared by most people in the United States in that demo. So which do you think? Is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, John, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. Far too often, people with political analysis try and make a black or white type of approach, a silver bullet type of approach. I think it's both, right? So I think what Democrats did was they did not have messaging that universally appealed to definitely the Puerto Rican voters, but you could make an argument young male voters of every stripe and color were kind of repelled by the party brand and the messaging, but also they didn't use the right messengers. So there needs to be some type of demographic targeting. It would be very, very useful if you brought around the biggest Puerto Rican baseball stars and stars that aren't coded as socialist to go and campaign on these issues for your side to help get out the vote. It's like bringing out Manny Ramirez, David Ortiz, Pedro Martinez to go campaign to Dominican Americans, saying that your side's the best side. They're going to listen, it's going to break through, and you're going to reach a wider audience. So I think they use the wrong messenger and they use the wrong message.
So Justin, something that you really emphasized in the last conversation that we had on the subject prior to the election was the joke that was made on stage at Madison Square Garden at Trump's rally. There was this comedian, Tony Hinchcliffe, I think his name is, who he's an insult comic, one-liner insults. He's going through all these insults of all these different demographic groups, Jews, Palestinians, Black Americans. And he says that the island of Puerto Rico is a floating island of garbage stuck in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And there was a huge reaction to this, including from yourself, and a lot of claims that this was going to make a big impact on the way Puerto Ricans voted. Are you reconsidering how important that moment was in hindsight?
Well, yeah, of course, right? I'm not somebody that takes in new information and doesn't change their mind. I think that it was very influential. I think it did have an impact on the election. Polling showed it had an impact on the election. Where I was just totally mistaken and wrong was on two accounts. Well, three, I guess you could say. One, how damaged and toxic the Democratic brand has become for male, low info, low propensity voters. That we're not deriding anybody. Low info means they're just not a political junkie like the folks listening to the show. Low propensity means they don't just vote every midterm and every election.
Yeah. So just to clarify, just to come off of your point, a low info voter could be someone with a PhD in mathematics who's just not paying that much attention to the daily political news.
They're not watching Fox News, MSNBC, CNN on a daily basis. So it's not derogatory. So I was just totally wrong. And we've had conversations about the brand being toxic. I didn't realize how toxic it was to that block. Number two, the economic conditions. I kind of bought some of the Biden-Harris messaging that the economy was great. I was looking at different indicators. But, prices were really high in a lot of staple goods for 3 years under President Biden. And they may have started to normalize a bit there at the end, but that stuck with voters. Buying a house is still incredibly hard, especially in blue cities because of these NIMBY laws and other reasons. And then the third factor is if you combine those two together, I didn't realize that would allow somebody to go and vote for Trump who they believe is racist and who thinks Trump doesn't like them or the island that they are from or have heritage from. So if you combined all that together, that's kind of my assessment of what happened. And yeah, I was wrong. I thought it was going to be a resounding vote for Harris. And Trump did the best among Hispanics by any GOP presidential candidate ever based on preliminary polling results that we have.
Before we started recording this podcast, Justin and I were having a conversation about to what extent state targeting, local targeting, demographic targeting is really the way forward. So I want to ask you a question while we're on the subject of Puerto Rican American voters with all of that in mind. So you and I were going back and forth about whether it's still really worthwhile to focus on separating states and separating demographic groups. And I think that, Justin, you are more open to that than I was arguing. I was kind of taking a position that Democrats should try a broader strategy that's national, that's not as demographically targeted, because I think that in the last period, there's been a little bit too much of an interest in separating out groups, whether geographic groups or demographic groups. And I think that the results of this election have poured a little bit of cold water in that approach. So, Justin, I think that you are more open to the idea of kind of maintaining a more demographically targeted way of approaching campaigns.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just there's so much nuance and so many different approaches. So generally overarching, broadly speaking, I tend to agree that the Democrats need to shift a little bit. But are we talking about get out the vote tactics, as in for the door knocking and phone calling? Are we talking about digital and TV advertising, radio advertising, and the specific tactics and how you target people that way? Or are we talking about using one message for Puerto Ricans and one message for Dominicans and one message for white men? There are so many different ways. And the way that I perceive things is we need to maintain the swing state strategy geographically, because those are the 7 or 8, if you want to include New Hampshire, states that as of the results now are the most up for grabs. So we should focus the most amount of resources on those states. I think that it is vital to have celebrities that resonate with these different demographic groups speak to these different demographic groups. Same with local grassroots leaders. So in that sense, yes, I think we should be targeting these groups in a more tailored way. But I also think, John, that the message that is sent to these groups largely can be the same as the overarching national message that is sent out to everybody. So package up the message and then get it to those groups in the most targeted way you can.
Yeah, I guess it's important to kind of say, as a bit of context or a caveat, that doing some demographic targeting and trying to have a unified national message isn't necessarily mutually exclusive. But I think that there is a degree of prioritization. And I think that in the recent period, Democrats have gotten a little bit down the demographic rabbit hole and have been taking as their first step, as their first approach, separating group by group. And what I'm now becoming more and more skeptical of is the idea that this is the way that you're going to kind of push your numbers and get over the line. So I want to ask you a question, Justin, with this in mind, while we're on the subject of the Puerto Rican American voters, because this is, an issue that you, as we said in the last episode, work on, understand intimately. It's something that's important to you as a professional. So what we were talking about in the last program was how to motivate Puerto Rican American voters to vote for Harris. And something that you suggested, which as we were talking about it last time, seemed really smart to me, was that Harris should have pushed a statehood agenda more prominently. And she should have come out earlier with a plan to make Puerto Rico the 51st state, made it a more central part of her messaging, made it very clear that this was a position that she was taking and was going to put real political muscle behind it. So now I want to ask you, kind of, as we're talking about the ways that you prioritize your campaigns, do you think that if Harris had been able to do that, it would have made enough of a difference for her to win the state of Pennsylvania?
The margins weren't 10,000 votes, so I don't know about that. However, I do know if the Democrats in Biden and Harris did push that issue for a year and made it feel like to these voters it was a central theme of the campaign, that it would have energized them like nothing else could outside of macroeconomic messaging and the factors and the headwinds that we saw in this election. So I think that, yes, it would have fundamentally changed how they approached each candidate. It would have made them think about the two candidates in very different terms. It would have put the island being garbage in stark contrast with the Harris and Biden approach to government. And also, I think it's really important to know that this is an issue generally where there's been polling on it. It's widely accepted by nearly every group of American. I think the Newsweek poll was 61% of all Americans support it. I saw a state level polling of Pennsylvanians showing it at plus 30%, not just Puerto Rican Pennsylvanians, but all Pennsylvanians, because it speaks to a sense of fairness and justice and equity that people inherently understand. And then as you explain this issue to them, that Puerto Ricans serve in the military at disproportionately high rates, that they don't have a vote for a voting member of the House, Senate, or president, it really begins to seep in. And generally speaking, Americans abhor taxation without representation. So I do think that this is an example, John, of a message that could be nationalized, but also would ring very effectively to a targeted demographic group of swing voters in vital swing states. Now, I say that as somebody that's working on the issue, so I'm inherently a little bit biased, but I think it's a unique motivator for these specific Americans living in the mainland. Because let's be honest, John, outside of Chicago and New York, where you have strong cohorts of socialist Puerto Ricans, the former mayor of San Juan, Ewing Cruz, who Trump got into it with, who's a big Bernie supporter, those type of Puerto Ricans, outside of those deep, deep, deep blue cities, most all other Puerto Ricans are extremely patriotic, love America, moved to America for the opportunities that it provides, and that they don't have on their mainland. So they also inherently understand that statehood is a good thing. So yes, John, I think it would have made a difference. And I think it's just another example of Democrats running scared because they saw Ted Cruz say, we're going to win the Senate so that we don't abolish the filibuster and Puerto Rico doesn't become a state. It's Democrats running scared against AOC and Nydia Velázquez and Luis Gutierrez, the progressives, borderline socialist wing of the party, who is pro-independence. And instead of controlling the messaging, they are letting these elite, out-of-touch progressives drive where the message goes to, and they are kind of closing off their minds to new possibilities. Plus, John, isn't it a big and bold idea in a campaign where Harris had no big and bold ideas to say, I'm going to admit the 51st state? It's a pretty big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to your just most recent point, I completely agree that the Harris campaign didn't have big and bold ideas. I think that a lot of us who were supporting her were honestly going into the election thinking, okay, the Democrats aren't going to have both chambers of Congress. There's not going to be a big focus on legislation. What we're going to see is some continuity at important federal agencies like the Treasury Department, and hope that things are going to sort of be on autopilot and work out okay because the trend lines for the economy are pretty positive and so on. And the alternative is frightening. But if you really want to galvanize and motivate voters, you want to give them something big to be excited about, hopefully that you can also deliver. If you want to get attention paid to your campaign generally, you want to be proposing things that get people talking about what you're saying too. And I think that this has been one of the biggest issues for Democrats in this entire Trump era. So the Democrats have been running against a gentleman who is an absolute genius at generating attention and dominating news cycles. And you're talking about Democrats being scared, running scared. I would put it slightly differently. The Democrats have been on defense. They've been reactive. For the last 8 years, it's been reactions to what Trump is saying and doing. A lot of the stuff that Trump says and does are substance free, but they're things that get the media talking. And then when the Democrats have an opportunity to talk, they're being asked about what Trump is saying. Or if they're even taking initiative to put out their own statements, they're putting out a statement that's in response to what Trump is saying and doing. And what the Democrats need to be able to do is start driving the conversation. And that's why big, bold, new, fresh ideas matter. They get people talking about what you're saying instead of just what the other person is saying. You're letting them become the main character of the news cycle. And in the last 4 years, the Democrats have had the presidency. They've had the White House. The main character in the news is usually the U.S. president, right? When Theodore Roosevelt was president, the early 20th century, he called the presidency the bully pulpit. Now, the word bully is not a schoolyard bully. It's not someone with a stick hitting the little kid. It's the old school use of the word bully, which means lovely, wonderful, happy. You know, bully, bully, you know how people used to say that, like huzzah, huzzah. It's an old kind of English style phrase. So it was the bully pulpit. It was the happy pulpit. It was a gift to be able to drive the national conversation, to get the news media to pay attention to whatever you're saying. So you can go out there and announce that you're going to make a speech, and you're guaranteed coverage. You're guaranteed attention. And this was something that Joe Biden, as president, for all of his wonderful qualities, was not able to take advantage of whatsoever.
Because
at almost no point.
Speak.
Yes, Justin. Yes, Justin. It's two things.
That was burning me up. I just had to get that in there. Like, well, it's still, it infuriates me that he was.
Maybe I'm beating around the bush here. Never been one known to do that. I'm kidding. But there's two parts of this. Number one, his staff would not let him speak. They were not confident in his ability to speak. They would not book him on.
Because his brain was addled.
They would not book him on interviews. They would not set up press conferences. They would not write speeches for him to deliver in primetime addresses the way President Obama and George W. Bush used to do, let alone Trump. And number two, they probably had good reason to be so reluctant. And we saw during the debate earlier this year, part of why. So when you've got the bully pulpit, you better take advantage of it because it's the greatest gift that you can have in driving attention. And he wasn't doing that. At no point during this 4 years did it really feel like Joe Biden was driving the conversation with something that he said and put out there.
Yes. So I agree with you. And I think another point that kind of underlines what you're saying, VP Harris ran a defensive campaign as well. And one example is Trump's no tax on tips. Trump goes to Nevada. He meets with a waitress, asks her what she wants. She goes, no tax on tips. He goes, that's a great idea. Starts running on it. Gets all his media attention. Harris then adopts a plan. Nobody's going to remember that Jackie Rosen, I believe it was, had a Senate bill out there potentially suggesting that, or was the first one to put a bill out there to try and codify that. No, nobody follows policy. It's the macro discussions. So I did just want to take a step back because we focused on Puerto Rico, we focused on Pennsylvania. And I'll just do this real quick, John. I'd like to get your thought on this. There are two ways that people have been internalizing the results. One way is that the microeconomic numbers and sentiment in the country made it unwinnable for Democrats, for an incumbent to come back and win a tight election in a polarized country. So nothing matters. It was just a fool's errand to begin with. I inherently disagree with that. The other is that Democratic messaging was broken and they didn't necessarily use things that break through to everybody. I think the reasons are kind of a blend between the two. I think the reason why Trump won is, one, you discussed it, John. We had a president who 80 or 90% of voters thought was too old to serve another 4 years, who implied that he was going to be a caretaker and only run one term. And then he got a little bit narcissistic, grandiose, tried to power through it, run again. So that put us on a bad footing. Two, you had the microeconomic factors, cost of living, for one, going up, that really hurt Democrats. And you couple that with a president that cannot talk, who cannot tout the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill. And you basically seed the narrative and create this vacuum where Republicans now are able to flood the zone with negative economic messaging while people are also feeling pain, right? They're worried about groceries. They're worried about gas. They're worried about just making it to their next meal. And then three, the Democratic messaging. I think that I did not understand that white women and women, generally speaking, were going to vote one way on abortion ballot initiatives and then vote for Republicans at the ballot, right? We saw that across the country. I thought that Trump was going to turn these voters off inherently because we'd been hearing it so much, and it looked like he was. Midterms was a surprising result for Democrats. But ultimately, I guess the Democrats cannot hope to build a coalition entirely based on the female vote. And then lastly, the messaging is broken. And I don't think it's necessarily on economic issues. It is broken with working class folks. It is broken with the folks that I grew up with in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, that are steel workers and plow driveways and sell beer at stadiums. It is largely due to the social issues. For 8 years, the messaging has been that the patriarchy is out to get you. Men are in a position of power over women, that men are, and it's been internalized by these low propensity, low information male voters, that they are bad and that they are to blame. And then you throw in the abortion issue, which a lot of these groups are more conservative, like Puerto Rican and Cuban and Hispanic Americans on social policy issues. But you throw in abortion and you're saying men are trying to control women's bodies. And that has been baked into the cake for 8 years. And that has had some massive damage across the country. And then you throw in the trans messaging, the they, them ad that Trump ran. And you get this perception from these young men that these Democrats are all way out of touch. They're definitely not for you. So then they look at Trump. And regardless of everything else, Trump is saying, I'm going to fight for the men. I'm going to make it so that the life is better for you. Now, I don't think he has any policy solutions. And that's why I don't think it's the economic policy messaging that Democrats need to tweak. It's just he's saying, I hear you. You're feeling pain. These people are treating you like shit. So here, come with me. Vote with me, and I will make sure this nonsense stops. But not only that, I'll fix the economy for you too. And all of that lends legitimacy to Trump being a better alternative. So I think I've learned a lot from you, John. It's not just macro trends; it's a bunch of different things fit together, and it conspired to elect a wannabe authoritarian, racist pig.
So there's two things here, then, Justin, that you've introduced. There's the economy and the mail voter communication stuff. So I want to talk about both of these things. So which one do you want me to address first?
Let's do the economy first,
Okay.
and then we'll do the social issues, and they tie all in.
Why is it happening that in the richest country in the history of the world, almost all of the new wealth is now in the hands of the few, while the vast majority of the American people are working longer hours for lower wages? How does it happen? Well, there are a lot of factors, but let me tell you that our disastrous trade agreements, NAFTA, CAFTA, permanent normal trade relations with China, are certainly one of the major reasons why the middle class is in decline and why more and more income and wealth goes to a handful of people on the top. Mr. President, the sad truth of the matter is many of the new jobs created in this country today are part-time and low-paying jobs. 30 or 40 years ago, working people who maybe had a high school degree could go out and get a job in a factory. They never got rich. Wasn't a glamorous job, but you know what? They had enough wages and benefits to make it into the middle class.
So I've got an interesting sort of, I can't call it interesting on my own. You'll have to decide whether you think this is interesting. But I've been looking at this economic thing with a lot of interest myself. So, you start off there by talking about how the inflation crisis, the cost of living crisis is a global issue. And we're seeing incumbent governments falling everywhere in the developed world, in places where there are competitive elections. And it seems as though there's very little that a campaign can do to overcome this, because every voter in every country is upset with the cost of living. They're upset with how the economy has shifted after the pandemic, and they want to take down the people in charge, right? So Matt Iglesias wrote a column in the New York Times that's probably the most comprehensive look at all of the cases. But some of the ones that come to mind right away are in the UK, where after 16 years in power, 15 years in power, 14 years in power, 14, got it right in the third time. 14 years in power, the Tory government were finally replaced by Labour after their election. They lost in a landslide. In Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party, which have governed Japan almost as a one-party state since the Second World War, it's a center-right party. They had a really bad electoral showing. The French legislative elections went really badly for the incumbents led by Emmanuel Macron. We're seeing really bad polling for the coalition in Germany, which is about to collapse. We're seeing terrible polling for Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party in Canada. And then in the USA, the Democrats actually ran the closest out of any of these cases. They probably had the best election results, but still lost power because they're also impacted by this wave of discontent with inflation and costs and all of that, right? So something that I think is pretty interesting here is that there has become this new conventional thinking about what the American people want, especially people in the working class, that has been embraced by the Democrats and Republicans in the United States. And these results are proving that way of thinking completely wrong, and very few people are really noticing this. So the storyline that we often hear is that the expansion of international trade in the 1990s and the increase of immigration to the United States has left the working man of middle America behind. And the workers of America are very upset that their jobs are being lost to offshoring of manufacturing industries or being taken by immigrants that come in, especially across the southern border. And that these are the core things to address to make the working people of America happy. And the idea in our mind, when we're imagining this, anyone who's hearing me say this is probably thinking of that factory worker in Youngstown, Ohio, with his lunchbox and hard hat. This is the image of what the working man in America is. He's upset about international trade.
We need to put blame where it rests. Bernie Sanders was the first one to push this very hard in 2014, 15, and 16 and used it in the primary. And then Trump came in and amplified everything. So just wanted to add that. Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, well, in the 1990s, when there was that protest at the WTO meeting, I think it was in Seattle in 1999, something like that. The push against free trade because of offshoring, this was associated with the left wing. And it became embraced, initially by these left-wing figures, like you're saying, Bernie Sanders and others like him. But then it became embraced by the Trump campaign in 2016, and it became the new conventional wisdom. And the Biden team completely adopted this and embraced this, and they've governed as if this is correct, this way of thinking. And when you hear people talk about this, even though it's been years and years and years since this has become a consensus, you still hear people talking about it as if it's this new insight. They say, oh, the conventional thinking about trade has been proven wrong. You can look right now and see articles after the 2024 election result that say Harris and Biden left the working man behind because of international trade, and they weren't focused on manufacturing enough. And they've left behind these, blue collar workers who all work in manufacturing, as we know. And it's still being produced as this new insight. I saw Chris Hayes on TV the other night talking about Sherrod Brown's loss, and he's saying, how did this guy lose? This is a guy who should be winning Ohio. He was one of the first people to be criticizing NAFTA and the WTO, just like you said, Justin. Bernie Sanders, Sherrod Brown, other kind of left-wing economic thinkers. Even today, they're being praised as being so far ahead of the curve on this new insight. Guess what, everybody? This is wrong. And the election results that we're seeing are actually proving how and why. So right now, our unemployment levels are historically low. We have very, very, very low unemployment levels.
We have all the jobs.
Exactly. Jobs are not really a major issue in America right now. There isn't a problem of jobs being shipped abroad that's leaving people without jobs. That's not happening. It's not what people are unhappy about. What are people unhappy about right now? Ask people that you meet. They're unhappy about prices.
Cost of shit, cost of gas, apples, bacon.
Yes, what they want are inexpensive goods to buy. And how do you get inexpensive goods? International trade. Remember how all of this started? All of this started, in the Biden era, the new wave of inflation. This started because of the disruption of international trade that came out of the COVID pandemic. The supply chain crisis. We heard about it in the news when it was happening. International trade was breaking down because factories abroad and shipping was paused due to the COVID pandemic. This prevented the circulation of goods. We had a supply shortage, and this led to prices increasing. This is where the economic backlash is coming from. It's not coming from offshoring. It's not coming from jobs being lost. We've got the jobs. What we don't have are the cheap things that we want to ship from overseas. The solution to this problem is more international trade. And if we're also worried about the cost of services, it's immigration. We want an increase in supply of labor. We've got a tight labor market. We've got a labor market where there's more demand than supply. And so you have to pay more than you used to get services. How do you increase the supply of labor? Immigration. And so the Democrats and Republicans, neither of them seem to have figured out something that's actually quite obvious, and that in the 1990s, we actually had the right idea about before we revised that period of incredible economic success and said, oh no, we made mistakes when everyone was rich and happy. Right now, people are not happy because they're paying too much for things. And the way to solve this problem is by doing what we did then, increase international trade, increase immigration. Instead, we're stuck in this idea of who the worker is and what they want. And honestly, if you talk to some workers in middle America, the ones that everyone's imagining sitting in a diner, they might tell you that they don't like trade because that's what they've been told is the cause of their problems. It's the messaging that's broken through to them.
And the messaging on this isn't incongruent, and it's not that hard. You can message on reshoring critical manufacturing jobs like the Biden administration has done through the CHIPS Act and the jobs that's being created from the Infrastructure Bill, Inflation Reduction Act on the one hand. So you can say we're protecting your manufacturing jobs. Also, people, we're going to make things really, really affordable for you. We're going to drive down the cost of goods by bringing in these, amazing milk from Australia. I know this is a contentious one. So the cars from South Korea, what have you. And you go and you do that messaging as well. And then guess what? You actually pass the TPP in these multinational trade deals. The cost of these goods go down over the course of 3-4 years. And then you have a pretty favorable economic position because your employment rate will probably be pretty good because you're reshoring all these critical manufacturing jobs. And then your cost of goods will be good, will be lower because you're getting goods that we don't produce normally and easily at home. And the last thing with immigration, you need to kind of have a draconian immigration messaging about closing down the border, but that is not incongruent with saying you're going to open up legal immigration. So there are ways that you can approach this through common sense that does, John, buck conventional political wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with everything that you just said. It's a lot of it is just about how you message and package things. So if you go and talk to people who are unhappy about how much things cost, and you ask them, are you mad about offshoring of jobs? They'll probably say yes. And people are romantic and sympathetic about made in America stickers and, they don't like seeing made in China, right? But what people are reacting to is not just the talking point and, what they think is happening. They're reacting to the increase in the price of goods. And that is a result not of the expansion of international trade, but the compression of international trade. So if you're in office, if you're Joe Biden and you've been president, what you want to do is bring costs down, and then people will be happy. And then you can explain to them how it works and why. So you want to actually figure out the solution so you can get a good result, so that you can have a good condition, so people will be satisfied with the economic circumstances. And this is when it comes to this thing of does nothing matter or not? And the real conditions of the economy do matter. And then it's up to you to explain why and how. And instead of trying to make a positive argument about immigration and trade, all of that has been conceded because of the new conventional wisdom.
And it's even worse because Trump is coming in. And this is I do have just so much disdain for the way that progressives view messaging and trying to push their solution with this zealot, almost like purity. We have President Trump coming in. He's messaged the entire campaign that he's going to raise tariffs. He's looking for a massive position for Robert Lighthizer, a almost draconian Smoot-Hawley type of person who believes in tariffs at his core. So what Democrats need to realize is, okay, if this happens, the cost of goods are likely to increase. And now we need to explain why it wasn't our fault, why it was this guy who did it, and how we have a solution. I turn on CNN, I believe. I see the progressive caucus chair, Jayapal, out there saying that she wants to eliminate free trade deals and she wants to have a protectionist view on trade. So not only is Trump going to likely, if he goes through with these economic policies that he's championed his whole life for 40, 50 years, he's gone in front of Congress and testified from them before, and it's one of the two things that he's been consistent on is tariffs and immigration. He's probably going to do that. The cost is going to go up, and you're going to have these progressives parroting Trump's message. And guess what? I would not be stunned if Democrats somehow get blamed for it.
So the Democrats did run a lot of ads saying that Trump's tariffs were going to raise prices. So we're starting to get a little bit closer to where we should be. But what they didn't do was offer an alternative, right? And the alternative might just be, I'm not going to put in new blanket tariffs. But the alternative isn't anything bolder or stronger than that. It's not a real counter argument. It's not really saying, I'm going to expand international trade. I'm going to reopen international trade. I'm going to make new trade deals like the one in the Pacific that will introduce new goods into our economy at a lower cost.
And you show all the tertiary jobs that are created from trade, the offloading at the ports in the commercial, the truck drivers driving the goods across the country, people stocking shelves. You show the prices going down with images at the grocery store. It's a very easy message to sell.
Yeah. So part of the reason that they're not willing to take that step is because the Democratic Party right now are in the thrall of labor unions, and they've been pandering to labor unions, especially the steel union, which has become way too politically powerful in this era. And I think it's partly because Joe Biden himself And a lot of his economic advisors do not actually believe in international trade. And they're a little bit more like those old school leftists that we were talking about, who were the first ones to really start condemning it. And here's something that I think really needs to be pointed out here. And I think this is a key misunderstanding that needs to be overcome. There is the idea that working class Americans are in manufacturing, right? That's the idea. If I say working class voter to you, Justin, or if I say even better, white working class voter, what are you imagining? You're imagining a guy in a factory, correct?
Yes, or a farm, but that's because I worked for a flyover state congressman.
Okay, well, farm is more accurate, so you're closer to the right track. But what I wanted to say here is that a lot of people are imagining that our working class voters are working in factories. And that's part of how we've got into this idea that to protect them, we need to shut down international trade. Guess what? Most working class Americans are in services. They are not working in manufacturing. A very small percentage of the American economy is manufacturing. We all imagine these people. Justin, how many people do you know that work in a factory? How many people have you met in your life that work in a factory?
The congressman I interned for used to work at a paper mill. So that kind of counts, right?
Okay,
So
okay, there you go. And like people will say, oh, Justin and John, these are, elitist coastal people. Well, we're from New England. That's where the Industrial Revolution in the United States started. That's where all the old factory. I live in an old factory building. And like many old factory buildings in the United States, it is no longer an operational factory.
To really put a fine point on what you're saying, I grew up in a lower middle class family, and practically a lot of my friends were working class people. One of them, their father would repair and restock Pepsi machines. Another was plowing roads, right?
Services.
Yeah. Okay. There was some construction. My father himself provided a service of cleaning hotels, the carpets and marble.
Yep.
So I know a lot of working class people, like
exactly
inherently. Another one was a physical therapist, a working class mother, which is another form of service. It's not a advanced medical degree.
Exactly.
No manufacturing.
This is what working class Americans are actually doing. What you've just described is a much more accurate picture of what working class Americans are than this romantic idea of the factory worker in the Midwest. And so we have been setting up our economic policy to favor a part of our population that is our entire image of an enormous subset of the U.S. workforce. And it's inaccurate. It's a myth. A much smaller percentage of people are actually working in these manufacturing fields than we have been led to believe, and certainly that our economic policy is leading people to believe. Another thing I want to say about this is the pandering to the labor unions. There is an important lesson here.
I've been thinking about this. Trump?
Well, yeah, I mean, partly. So I've been thinking about this a lot. When people talk about how Trump was able to successfully message to a lot of the American public, what you hear about a lot is that he was anti-elitist, right? And that the elite institutions, the American people don't like the elite institutions. And so the fact that he was railing against the elites was appealing to people, right? Guess what? All of politics and all of human history has been about the competition between elites, among elites. And that's exactly what this is too. Trump represents a different cohort of elites than the cohort of elites that are represented by Biden and Harris. They're both elite groups. And so your messaging can point to almost any target and depict them accurately as an elite. And you can depict yourself accurately as someone who's fighting elites. So if you want to make a positive argument for international trade that's populist, you can do that by talking about how you are taking on the labor unions, right?
Well, you don't even necessarily need to go that far, right? Because it's going to take a while for the Democrats to realize that the unions are now Republican, largely due to social messaging. But what you could do, John, Americans almost universally hate corporations now. If you look at polling, corporations are the bad guy. You can say, we are going to fight corporations through fair and free trade because it's going to create more competition for them. And then the corporations that treat you better because they've been treating you like shit, they're the ones that are going to lower their costs. They're the ones that are going to win more market share. They're the ones that are going to build new stores, and they're the ones that are going to win. And your life will be better because we are taking on these corporations who we will also make sure they pay their fair share in tax.
That's another great example of how you can do this. I think that there is an idea out there that an argument that's positive for trade is fundamentally elitist, and that populists want to restrict trade and elitists want to expand it. It doesn't need to be that way. Just like I said, the average person in America who is not wealthy, who is making a middle income salary, they're concerned about the cost of living. Deliver for the broad general public by bringing costs down. And a good way to do that is by expanding international trade. You can be populist and support international trade. People have not even tried to do this for too long, but you can do it. Say you're taking on corporations, say you're taking on corrupt labor unions that are entrenched economic, powerful interests in this country. And you're going to break their backs and deliver for the broad public by bringing down prices, which is what people want.
And you can also message it in a way that shows you are elevating the American worker by breaking down these barriers from these foreign countries that are preventing our goods, which are naturally better because they're created in America, from going overseas. And by breaking down these barriers, you're allowing the American worker to compete on the global stage. And when an American worker has the ability to compete fairly, nobody outdoes their job like the American worker. There are so many ways and how foreigners want to buy our goods. So there's going to be a rush to get these export. It's a very simple thing that even my former congressman boss, when I was handling trade for him, he was able to message it to a conservative district as a member of the Tea Party, the Freedom Caucus, one of 2 members of 40 to vote in favor of free trade. He was able to go out there and make an effective message to these voters that did not hurt him. So I agree with you. I think that there needs to be a paradigm shift. Now, I think we need to get into the social policy aspect of things. So there is this battle going on in the Democratic Party that John just kind of approached one aspect of it. It's Nancy Pelosi versus the progressives. Nancy Pelosi's free trade, the progressives are protectionist. So that is one battle that has been raging, and the progressives kind of won, obviously, with Biden's protectionist policies, his anti-free trade perspective, doing nothing on free trade in 4 years, so on and so forth. The other aspect is, and really quickly, John, trade is not a complex economic messaging. It is, we are going to allow Americans to compete and we're going to drive down the cost of goods. That is Trump messaging 101. Just repeat that shit over and over and over again, and people will understand it.
And it's going to be, in the right hands, it's going to be anti-Trump messaging that is populist. And that's what the Democrats need to figure out how to do. Yeah.
Yes.
Democrats are certainly grappling with the way forward. And after the loss Tuesday, you are one of the lawmakers who've said that Democrats are out of touch with the American people, saying they spend way too much time trying not to offend anyone rather than being brutally honest about the challenges many Americans face. Then as part of that argument, you told the New York Times, quote, "I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that." I know that you have put out a follow-up statement. I do want to give you a chance to explain your comments because you know they have faced backlash. So you've got the floor.
Sure. No, thank you, Alex, very much. And look, I was just speaking authentically as a dad about one of many issues where I think we're just out of touch with the majority of voters. And I stand by my position. You know, maybe I didn't get all the words exactly right. But the point is that the backlash I've received proves my point that we can't even have these discussions as a party. I mean, the chairman of the Massachusetts Democratic Party wouldn't even return my phone call. And we've got to be able to have these debates. But instead, we have a wing of our party that shames us, that tries to cancel people who even bring up these difficult topics, and frankly, shames voters. This is the same group of people who told us to defund the police, who told us that there wasn't a problem at the southern border, who told us that inflation was transient, whatever that means, and who told us that Biden was just fine. And they're out of touch with voters. If we just listen to voters on all of these issues, they were telling us the truth. So we've got to be willing to have these debates. I'm willing to have my mind changed. In fact, I've had some really good conversations in just the last few days with LGBTQ advocates and others, some of whom agree with me, others who don't, but are willing to engage in a thoughtful discussion rather than just trying to cancel one person or another. But we've got to have these debates now to come up with a new strategy for the party, a winning strategy, so that come January, we can be totally united to defeat the Trump agenda, which we know that Trump is going to attack the rights of minorities in this country, including trans people. He's going to try to take away freedoms from women and others. We've got to be united with a winning strategy to prevent that from happening.
So it's not like we're going out there explaining tariffs and getting in all these debates. But if you do go on a Joe Rogan podcast, you can explain all this stuff in a coherent, logical, consistent way because the facts are on your side. The second aspect, though, which I already touched on, is social messaging. And what has happened is a lot of people don't understand this, but there has been almost a capture of progressive staffers controlling a lot of these even more centrist liberal offices where these staff kind of control things, even for more of a moderate member like Seth Moulton, and it kind of drives DC groupthink in a way, specifically in the Liberal Party. So we've already touched on the anti-male messaging. I am not disparaging the desire to create equality in the country. I'm not disparaging the desire to break down the quote unquote patriarchy because, things have been set up for hundreds of years in America, thousands of years across the globe to typically favor a guy over a woman.
So I've got an observation about this that I want to share. And this is less a solution than it is more just a diagnosis that I think people should be thinking about. So something that happened in this last election that has probably caught a lot of Democrats off guard is how poorly they did with young men. They actually lost young men. So it's not even just like Hispanics, Latinos that we were talking about before, where the Republicans got mid-high 40s. They actually lost this demographic group. The Republicans got something like 55% of young men.
Republicans and Trump also won 55% of young Hispanic men.
Yes. So the Democrats have really fallen in love with the idea that they're the party of young voters. And we were talking about this in the last episode, even before we knew how the election was going to shake out, actually. And I was making the claim that Democrats should maybe get kind of more comfortable courting older voters, even though they're so attached to young voters. I think there's a romance around young voters. You always feel as though the young voters are on the moral side. There's the idea that they represent the future. So it's a positive outlook for your party if you can keep that generation, which the Democrats kind of have with our generation, the millennials. Losing young voters this time, young male voters, is probably scary for Democrats because it really challenges the idea that, the future is on their side. I think it's important for them to recognize that this stuff isn't inevitable and they're not always going to win young voters, and the future isn't necessarily on their side because that should shake them into a little bit bolder action. But I've got a theory for why young men in particular are resistant to a lot of the messages that come from Democrats and culturally affiliated voices. So something that Democrats and culturally affiliated voices really emphasize is something that you mentioned, Justin, which is the patriarchy, right? So this is the idea that authority is male. Patriarchy really means old men, not just men, but the way it's used today is really to emphasize just men broadly, that men are the ones in power, and that it's important to break down the power of men because they monopolize power in the world and society. And so this is a generally accurate reading of world history. Men have generally been in positions of power throughout world history. But if you're a young man in the United States, something that I think is maybe under-recognized is that your experiences of authority in your life are going to be predominantly female, in fact. And part of that is because there's a huge gender gap in schools of teachers, right? So most teachers in the United States, I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but I think it's something like 70% or more of teachers in schools in the United States are women. And so if you're a young man, if you're in the youngest demographic group that's able to vote, you're 18 to 21 years old, almost your entire life, the authority figures that have been most proximate to you have actually been women. So it's harder for you to accept, accurate or inaccurate, that in society, generally, men are the ones in power because your immediate experiences have been almost exclusively of women in power. And so as the idea of the patriarchy is more and more emphasized, you're alienating people who don't believe that it's accurate because their own personal experiences have been so different.
I also think there are ways to address and break down the patriarchy without using the ham-fisted messaging that Democrats have been using, which is basically it turns into men are bad, men are to blame, and it all gets kind of wrapped into one, right? Like the Me Too movement, which was a great thing objectively, kind of conflates into the patriarchy movement, kind of conflates into the abortion argument that the politicians are telling you all these men are going to control women's bodies. So you have all of these narratives coming together, and there is a way to message individually on each of these without scapegoating all males. But also we need to look at technology and the proliferation of technology and dating apps and how it's a very different experience for a lot of women on these dating apps than young men on these dating apps. And there is an epidemic of loneliness going out throughout our country for these young men. And it's driving them to things like go down YouTube rabbit holes and 4chan. And they are hearing this message that they are in control, that they are in power, specifically working class men. And they are looking around and they're miserable. So they're miserable. They're getting told they are to blame for why women are miserable. And you have one party that continues to just hammer them. Now, not only that, you add in the fact that this one party that is hammering men is too afraid to go out and go do sports podcasts, go do lifestyle podcasts, go do other podcasts with these hosts that are wildly popular with young men, because the elites in the party, these progressive staffers and others, have been coding Joe Rogan as the epitome of male toxicity. So you have all of these things combining: a negative message on men, men being in a bad spot in our country, along with the unwillingness to go and be on platforms that these young men listen to. And how can you possibly win? And I want to just read a quote. There was a whole issue in the campaign: should Harris go on Rogan or not? Well, Jennifer Palmieri, a senior advisor to Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, said during the campaign, here's the quote: "There was a backlash with some of our progressive staff that didn't want her to be on the Joe Rogan show, and how there would be backlash from them if Harris appeared on the show." That is a quote from today. So instead of trying to reach a vital voting bloc with a megaphone, the Harris campaign was too afraid to go out and do the show because they would be called transphobic for going on Joe Rogan's show. They would be called sexist for going on Joe Rogan's show. And that is how you push young men away. You demonize them and then you don't go and speak to them. And that's the Democratic purity, that zealot progressive mindset that I am very concerned about. And I don't know if the party can break away from it.
So I do want to first say that I saw that quote that you just read, and that is one respected journalist who has kind of presented that version of what happened with Rogan. I know that there are other reporters that are disputing that that's exactly what happened, that it was genuinely a scheduling issue and they had tried to make it work. We don't really know, but I think in that instance. But I think that your general point, though, is correct, that on the Democratic side, there has been this trepidation to get on the wrong side of interest groups, right? That's a big problem. So in 2016, with the Republicans, and it's funny because I feel like this episode we are complimenting Donald Trump way more than we should be, but what we're really doing is taking stock of his ability to shake up the political system and draw attention, which are the things that he's been good at.
Let's be really clear. He ran a terrible campaign.
Yeah.
He just got lucky from the macro and then these longer term shifts that we are discussing and trying to unpack in the Democratic Party.
Yeah. And part of the reason why we're trying to put forward all these ideas for how to pivot and how to approach things differently is because we're so frustrated to see someone that we hold in such contempt be successful. So anyway, if you look at the 2016 election cycle, going into that race, the Republicans had kind of a similar dynamic to what the Democrats have now with their interest groups, which was there was a real fear of stepping on the wrong toes. There was a trepidation around criticizing this interest group or that interest group, or saying, well, you can't say this, you can't say that. The shibboleths of conservative politics, the ecosystem and networks that kept Republican politics together. And what Trump did was he kind of said whatever he wanted to say, and transgressed a lot of these invisible fault lines, and triggered those lines with those interest groups. And it was surprising how much he was able to sort of get away with and maintain support among the voters he needed. Everyone thought that these groups really mattered, that they were driving a lot of votes, that you couldn't win while getting on their bad side. And he showed that you could. So the Democrats right now, I think, might end up finding the same thing once they try. I think that Democrats are going to be surprised how much they can get away with getting on the wrong side of interest groups that they've convinced themselves are very powerful. So I think Republicans, you mentioned Democrats, you mentioned Seth Moulton. He's already started pressing these buttons. There's going to be others, and they're going to realize that you can get on the wrong side of these interest groups and they don't actually matter that much.
There's one that won a statewide race in a Trump plus 30 state, who his opponent was, I believe it was 2022, got to look this up. His opponent was running transgender advertising attack ads on him. And Governor Andy Beshear came out in the New York Times today, which is 11/13 Wednesday, ran an ad about how we can stay true to LGBTQIA groups. We don't have to demonize them, and we can still, evolve our messaging. Okay. What did Andy Beshear do? He ran a commercial rebutting the trans attack ads, saying that he does not support gender reassignment surgery for minors and that is not legal in Kentucky. That is something that VP Harris and Democrats in DC on a presidential campaign were unable to do because they were afraid of special interest groups. Yet a lot of polling and focus groups are showing that they-them ad that Trump ran against Harris was very effective. And another reason why it's very effective is a lot of these young Hispanic men that we're talking about, a lot of these young white men that we're talking about tend to be a little bit more socially conservative. 70% of the country, 80% of the country does not believe in this issue of gender reassignment surgery for children, for minors. They also, a lot of the country is with Seth Moulton. 70% do not believe that a now trans girl, so somebody that transitioned from being a boy to a girl, should be playing youth sports with other women. And the Republicans were able to capitalize on that because, in large part, what Seth Moulton described was there is a fear in Democratic circles from getting on the other side of these progressives. And what happened when he did that? Former staff wrote an open letter criticizing him, calling on him to apologize. The Salem, Massachusetts Democrats, I think they said he was Nazi adjacent or something like that. Democrats in his own hometown, the strong Democratic voice. And there were other backlash. So I just think it's really important to note that it's very, very, very important to be aligned with the majority of the American public, and you can be aligned with them without throwing these minority groups overboard and demonizing them. You can do two things at one time.
Yeah, and the other thing is we talk about what the majority of the American public want as if it's set. But what we were saying about trade and all of that earlier, I mean, I truly believe that through positive, aggressive messaging, the bully pulpit and all of that, you can shape what the majority of the American public want. It's not static. You are, people in powerful political messaging positions like the president of the United States or a candidate for president, they're able to affect what the American public want, not just respond to it and treat it.
And there's a really important example though, right? The ground needs to be set and the message needs to be seeping in before you can use that bully pulpit to switch perception, right? So in 2008, President Obama refused to run on gay marriage. He refused. The country was shifting. There were a lot of TV shows that were exalting gay couples and openness to gay people, and this movement was really taking hold. So Obama saw that this was happening in 2012. He ran a campaign saying he supports gay marriage. That was one of the first times that I can think of, John, of a major party nominee coming out in favor of gay rights like that. So it's,
I mean, like you said, the ground was partly set by what was happening in the culture, but also him coming out and endorsing the policy probably moved another large cohort of voters as well.
So I need to be real clear. Like, I am all on board with trans people, trans rights. It's just there are, certain ways that we need to talk about these issues. And when these untrue attacks are being leveled against Democrats for supporting things that they don't support and generally aren't happening in the country, they need to come out here and say, no, I don't support that. It's not happening. And also, if some Democrats want to come out there and run against, the sports issue, there cannot be this purity across the board where elected officials are afraid of speaking out because of backlash from these interest groups, because the result is, John, when the national context is not favorable for your party and you all have the same uniform messaging, you're going to get wiped out like we saw.
Looking at this example of Moulton, you were talking about how a former staffer and then members of interest groups, they called him a Nazi after the statement that he made. So this is going to benefit Moulton. He's actually going to benefit from picking fights with interest groups that appear overzealous or are trying to, in the view of many people, police language. So picking fights with interest groups on your side is something that can be received very positively. And we're talking about how so many political figures are afraid of doing this. They're going to increasingly find out that they benefit from doing it. That's what we saw in the 2016 cycle, like we were talking about. At the time, people were so exhausted by all the rules around what Republicans could and couldn't say and where they could and couldn't be on policy. And people were itching for that glass to be broken. And the Democrats are going to find that they're in a similar situation now, because we're at the end of this Obama era of Democratic Party politics, and it's ready to be shaken up. And so by crossing lines and transgressing some of the invisible rules about what you can and can't say, not only is it not going to hurt Moulton, it's going to help him. And back to my example, you could do this with an issue like international trade. Pick a fight with the labor union, get on their bad side, and see how you're actually rewarded by a lot of voters. That the labor union might not be as powerful as in your mind you've trained yourself to believe they are. And a lot of this is just about being open to a bigger set of possibilities in politics. And that is certainly something that everyone should be prepared for.